The Black Ancestry Network Group, along with other researchers and research groups all over the internet, are discovering new alternative histories that just so happen to coincide with new archaeological discoveries that reveal a history that some might say is hard to believe. Regardless of how unbelievable it might sound, the hard evidence is undeniable and very difficult to ignore. The Black Ancestry Network Group has been doing research concerning the descendants of the 5 civilized tribes, and what we have discovered is an alternate history that for the most part is hidden from the records. Nevertheless, the evidence suggests that this alternate theory concerning these 5 tribes is also undeniable. This audio will give you the theory concerning this alternate history, but you will need to stay tuned to the Black Ancestry Network Group for other audio records that will be produced, that will give you more detailed information, that will allow you to see a very valid alternative look at the facts with regard to this alternate history. Many historians, researchers, and archaeologists combined with DNA evidence are realizing that it is highly probable that black people who originated out of Africa had made their homes in North America long before Christopher Columbus set foot on the continent. Columbus himself says in his memoirs that when he arrived in North America, he was greeted by who he thought would be Indians that originated out of India. But instead, he was greeted by dark-colored people, who greeted Columbus with the Hebrew credo, "The Lord our God is one." There were many explorers that visited North America such as Hernando de Soto and Le Fatau. But for the Black Ancestry Network Group, there is one explorer that stands out from the rest. His name was James Adair. James Adair was born in 1709, some 23 years before the birth of George Washington, who would one day be the President of the United States. Adair was born and raised in Ireland, but in 1739, he was living with the aboriginal indigenous people of North America, when future President George Washington would have been around 7 years old. Because of the misconceptions of Christopher Columbus, Adair also identified the aboriginal people as Indians. Adair lived amongst several tribes in the southern regions, off of the eastern seaboard of North America, and he resided with these tribes for 40 years. During these 40 years, Adair wrote down his observations. It is for this reason that the Black Ancestry Network Group would lean very heavily on Adair's eyewitness accounts concerning the aboriginal people who were misclassified as Indians by Columbus. And because he lived with them for 40 years, it is not far-fetched for me to say that when it comes to the inhabitants of North America living in the southern areas, James Adair is the only expert on these tribes, then, and now. For 40 years and was almost entirely cut off from the outside world. From 1744 he resided chiefly among the Chickasaw. In the 1740s he led a British trade mission to the eastern Choctaw tribe at the height of King George's War in an effort to win this nation over from French influence. He dealt extensively with Chief Red Shoes, the leader of the pro-British faction of the Choctaw. This eventually erupted into a fierce civil war amongst the Choctaw which led to Red Shoes' assassination in 1749. Adair went forward under the direction of James Glenn, governor of South Carolina, but then vehemently blames him for the mission's failure and the loss of his personal fortune. In 1775, stimulated by the encouragement of a few intimate friends, such as Sir William Johnson, 1st Baronet, Colonel George Croghan, George Galphin, and Lachlan McGillivray, Adair determined to throw his notes into the form of a book. He mentions a string of disadvantages under which he labored, notably the jealousy, secrecy, and closeness of the Indians, but hoped to be able to correct the very superficial notions that prevailed as to their civilization. His book was called The History of the American Indians, containing an account of their origin, language, manners, and other particulars, sufficient to render it a complete Indian system, with a new map of the country. The value of Adair's work as showing the relations between the Indians and the English traders was recognized, and a German translation appeared at Breslau in 1782. It must be admitted that a very disproportionate space is given to the hypothesis that the American Indians are descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Thomas Thorogood, adopting an old idea of the Spanish Las Casas, had first maintained this theory in English in 1650 in his book, Jews in America. He was the first English author to argue in 1650 that American Indians were descended from the lost 10 tribes of the biblical ancient Israelites. This theory was an early 16th century Christian theory, that was revived in popularity during the beginning of the English colonization of North America in the 17th century. Both Roger Williams, an English-born American Puritan minister, theologian, and author who founded Providence Plantations, and Jonathan Edwards, an American revivalist preacher, philosopher, and Congregationalist theologian, seemed rather inclined to favor the view, which, as elaborately set forth by Adair, has since found champions in Elias Boudinot, author of Star in the West, written in 1816, which was a humble attempt to discover the long-lost 10 tribes of Israel, preparatory to their return to their beloved city, Jerusalem. And in Edward King, Viscount Kingsborough, who was an Irish antiquarian who sought to prove that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were a lost tribe of Israel. Edward King made the points of similarity between the Jews and Indians. Adair emphasized the division into tribes, worship of a great spirit, Yahudah, notions of a theocracy, of ablutions and uncleanness, cities of refuge, and practices with regard to divorce, and raising seed to a deceased brother. The bias imparted by this theory to many of Adair's remarks led Volney, a French philosopher, abolitionist, writer, Orientalist, and politician, to condemn the whole book. The second half of the book is more strictly an account of the Catawba, Cherokee, Muskogee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations. Lord Kingsborough reprinted the whole of the first part of Adair's work, in the 8th volume of his sumptuous Mexican Antiquities, with an appendix of notes and illustrations from unedited works by French and Spanish authors, affording the most satisfactory proofs of Adair's veracity in the minutest particulars. Adair's map of the American Indian nations is partially reproduced in Windsor's History of America. The totality of the literature, and the men behind the pen, with regard to the research being conducted on the original inhabitants of North America, have been hidden. But from who, and for what reason? The Black Ancestry Network Group discovered the works of James Adair, while doing research related to the 5 tribes. The administrator for the group was searching through letters written by the Founding Fathers of the United States, when he came across a letter that was written by John Adams, and addressed to Thomas Jefferson. You can listen to these letters in the form of an audio recording on the Black Ancestry Network Group's YouTube channel. At this point, there are a few questions that must be asked. First, why aren't these particular explorers not mentioned in our history books? And secondly, why didn't Thomas Jefferson and John Adams disclose this information to the nation, that they were in the process of creating? Could it be that there was a plan to take the land from the original inhabitants? There are 5 audio recordings of James Adair's book, History of the American Indians, on the Black Ancestry Network Group YouTube channel. On the next installment of the Yahudah ID, we will delve deeper into the Aboriginal Indigenous people, to get a better understanding of their relationship with the Founding Fathers. If you would like to be alerted as to when new content is added to this channel, subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications, and also, like and share, to help the channel. Until next time, this portion of the Yahudah ID will end in 3, 2, 1.